now moving on to the New Testament and Jesus and the temple. And the passage I've been asked to read from Mark is Jesus prophesying about what's going to happen to the temple, its destruction, just about 40 years later, and warning people to be ready, and all the terrible things that are going to accompany that event. So it's Mark 13, verses 1 to 27. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings."
"You see all these great buildings," replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're all about to be fulfilled?" Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am he,' and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, famine, There'll be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginnings of birth pains. You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get the cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning, when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'Look, there he is,' do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So be on your guard. I have told you everything in advance. But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's now my pleasure to invite the Rev Dr. Helen Paynter to come and speak to us again. If this is your first visit to this weekend, Bible weekend, Helen is, I've got the written bit here, so I'll put it well. Is a Baptist minister and tutor in biblical studies at Bristol Baptist College. She has a particular interest in the Old Testament and the issue of biblical violence, which we looked at before lunch. And so we carried on with the temple part of that. So here we go with session 3.
Or 5, depending on which you count it. Thank you. Thank you so much. I loved that song that we sang just now, History. No one else in history is like him, and history himself belongs to him, and that's not a bad place to position ourselves as we turn to the New Testament. So we finished on a cliffhanger, and I'm sure none of you could guess what the answer to the cliffhanger was going to be. But let me just remind you what that cliffhanger was. At the close of the Old Testament, there was no Davidic king on the throne. We'll just note that. It's not the main theme that we're talking about today, but we do need to note it. There was apparently no active presence in the temple. There was the question of the growing corruption of the temple and that kind of looming warning stroke threat that God would one day come to visit with a large V. And there was the question, which perhaps they weren't asking, but we need to ask as we look back, of who can enter the cosmic sanctuary? Even if there's a high priest going in and out of the actual temple, who is going to go into the true temple in the heavens? So this is our cliffhanger. This is the question on which the Old Testament ends, and this is where we pick up this afternoon. And that's kind of your answer, in case you hadn't worked it out. Let's go into that in a bit more detail. So let's just refresh our memory about the temple functions that we spoke about this morning. We said that the temple has a triple function. It is a place of atonement or forgiveness. It's a place of revelation and teaching from God. It's a place where the presence of God can be encountered. That's the kind of triple function. As part of the temple setup, a mediator would go through the cloudy veil thing, the cloud thing, into the presence of God on behalf of all of the people. And we spoke principally, or perhaps the driving metaphor is the temple as the portal between heaven and earth. So that's just a recap to get us into the right set of thinking as we start to look at the Gospels. Because as I think you will know already, but we're going to look at in more detail, Jesus is represented in all 4 Gospels as the fulfillment of all of those temple functions. And because this theme is rich and thick, remember we talked about thick last night, because this theme is rich and thick, and it's not simply, you can't cash it out in a single story. He is not only the temple, he's also the high priest. Yes, and so we'll see elements of these, and they kind of switch a bit between them. So we need to be subtle enough, readers and listeners, to kind of hold those two things in our mind at once. Another example of not pushing these metaphors to their absolute limits. Okay, we're going to look first at what's known as the synoptic Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which have a lot of material in common. And you may remember that Jesus himself says these words about himself. He says, "Something greater than the temple is here." Now, this is the most phenomenal claim. We've kind of got a sense already, I think, of the what's the word I'm looking for? The weight which the temple has in the thinking of the day, the theological weight, the presence of God, the work it does for the nation in terms of forgiveness and atonement, and all these things we're speaking about. The other thing that's going on in Jesus' day, not theologically but politically, is that the temple is the centre of. It's like Westminster as well, at least in terms of the Jewish authorities. You've got the Roman authorities separately, but the temple is where all the kind of all the big conversations are going on within among the Jewish leaders. So when some jumped up rabbi from Nazareth comes along and says something bigger than the temple is here, pointing to himself, you can imagine the way that is going to, you don't need to imagine, I'm sure you know, but you can imagine why this is received with such horror, and why perhaps you can understand why the Jewish leaders, not suggesting we endorse it, but perhaps we can understand why the Jewish leaders go and start trying to plot for his downfall. So let's just look, remembering these chief functions of the temple, let's look at how we see those being played out. Because when some of the stories that we're really familiar with, and we love to read, and they're great in their own right, but they're also pointers to us that Jesus is doing things that only can happen in the temple. So here's the classic one. This is the man who is lowered through the roof in that house in Capernaum. You remember the story, I'm sure, picking up partway through when they couldn't bring him to Jesus because of the crowd. They removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic man lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the scribes who were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God himself? And of course, there is such a deep irony there, because the very heart of their critique, the very essence of their complaint against him, who can forgive sins but God himself? And I think the writer is inviting us to say, well, yes, quite so. But here is the temple function being enacted by Jesus. Only God himself can forgive sins. It only happens in the temple, and here's Jesus doing it in a random house in Capernaum. Interestingly, both of these texts and so many others in the Synoptic Gospels are kind of inviting the reader, and indeed when Jesus speaks, he's inviting his listeners to wrestle with the question of who am I? And I don't know if you've ever noticed that Jesus almost never answers a question straight. He often answers it with another question, or he answers apparently a different question altogether. And so often those conversations are basically, who do you say that I am? You might remember this, a bit of an aside, but do you remember two brothers come to Jesus and say, can you help us sort out this family dispute about the inheritance? Do you remember that? It's just a little tiny moment in one of the Gospels. And Jesus comes to them, and Jesus says to them, why have you come to me? Who made me the judge between you? And he's not, I don't think he's necessarily saying what I would be saying if I said that. I'd be saying, oh, nothing to do with me. I think Jesus is actually saying, why have you come to me? Who made me the judge over you? So Jesus is always doing this, and I think here are two examples where we see that. I'm going to skip on now. It's so much I could show you. We could have spent the whole day looking at the Gospels and this theme in the Gospels, and I'm just trying to cherry pick a few of the most, perhaps some of the most beautiful ones. I want to show you the story, which is quite misunderstood sometimes towards the end of Jesus' life in Holy Week. So let me read to you from Mark 11. We'll read it and then I'll make a few comments. Palm Sunday has happened, and this is the Monday. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, Jesus went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching. Sorry, I'm struggling to read it. It's my own fault. Bear with me a second. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Now, this passage has been so misunderstood in my view. Two big ways it's misunderstood, I think. The first is the description of Jesus as hangry. Do you know that expression? Hangry, yeah? He's really hungry and he's really fed up and grumpy, and therefore he curses the fig tree in a fit of irritation with it. Okay, that's the first error in my view. And the second error is to think that Jesus flipped and just lost his temper in the temple. Kind of two facets of the same comment, I think, really. And I think that is utterly wrong. Both of those are utterly wrong. One of the big clues utterly wrong is that Jesus hasn't just walked into the temple. On Palm Sunday, he walks into the temple, has a little look around, and goes home for the night. If he was going to flip, he would have flipped then. Okay? This is an intentional action. He has deliberately come back to the temple. Remember our cliffhanger. One of the things that they are waiting for, expecting, fearing, should be fearing, is the visit with the capital V. Okay. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is the way that Mark has positioned this story. And do you notice the story of the fig tree is broken in half and that the story of the temple sits within it? This is known, and I know I joked yesterday about blowing your socks off being a technical language, but this is genuinely known as a Markan sandwich. Okay? A Markan sandwich. Because Mark loves to do this. He loves to take a story, split it in half, put another story in the middle, and the two things inform one another. It's a kind of literary device of saying, look, let me explain the one thing by means of the other, and it kind of links them in that way. So let's just think about this a little bit more. So in the Old Testament, part of that expectation that God would visit, with a capital V, his temple, there's a whole load of kind of parables around that, and a lot of them centre on the question of fruitfulness. In fact, I think I quoted one in the workshop just now about the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah 2. And, you know, how my loved one created a vineyard on a fertile hillside, and what more could I have done for my vineyard than I did for it? And then if we read on, it goes on to say, so why is it that when I looked for a harvest of righteousness, I saw only bloodshed? So this question of, is this a fruitful people, links with the question of, is this temple doing what it's supposed to be doing? So so this is not the season for figs, okay? And Jesus knows that. He's a country boy, okay? So when he sees a fig tree and walks up to it going, I wonder if there's any figs to eat. There are no figs. May you never eat fruit again. He's not genuinely expecting food because he knows that that's not going to be there. This is a performed action. And if you know the Old Testament prophets, you'll know that they do performative prophecy quite a lot, and that is what Jesus is doing with the fig tree. And Mark has split that story to remind us of all that Old Testament background and to draw our attention now to what is going on in the temple. And of course, this moment in the temple is the visit with the capital V that God has been warning about. Two elements, I think, that he finds lacking in the temple, two elements that come to the fore here. The first is just the corruption and the commercialization and the general, the hubbub that is cluttering the courts of the Lord. The second, the language of this being a house of prayer for all nations, draws in some Old Testament passages that speak about the Gentiles having space to pray, Gentiles being invited to come and worship as well. And where all this is happening is the only place in the temple where the Gentiles were permitted. And so what we've got going on, I think, is he's found the temple lacking in two very significant areas. And linking this, Mark does, with the Old Testament warnings about fruitfulness, we get this package where we are clearly seeing Jesus judging the temple and finding it lacking. The thing that Tom Wright points out about this is that Jesus' actions will have interrupted temple activity for half an hour or so, I don't know. But he prevents the buying and selling of the special animals for sacrifice. It would have been a disruptive act. Okay, they're going to pick things up, they're going to dust it all off, they're going to put it back on the tables and business as usual. But Jesus has interrupted temple function for a short while, and that is very significant because Jesus is foreshadowing the fact that the temple is very shortly about to become completely redundant because he is the true temple. You following me? Great. So that's just a little snippet of some things in the Synoptic Gospels that point to Jesus as the true temple. John, oh my word, John goes to town on this, and we could have spent all day in John's prologue. Okay, hands up. Oh, let me read this first one to you initially. So this is from John's prologue. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's... Is it battery?
No, it's not battery. I'll switch over to that.
And so the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." Rich words, aren't they? We could sit and sit and sit with this. Let me point out a couple of things from these glorious verses. How many of you are familiar with the message which says the word became flesh and moved into the neighbourhood? I do like Eugene Peterson. I think he's marvellous in many ways, but please don't read the message as the Bible. It's one man's interpretation of the Bible. Read it alongside your actual Bible. But he really misses it here. He really does, because that language of lived among us, the word became flesh and lived, or some translations say dwelt among us. It's not moved into the neighbourhood. He tabernacled with us. The word became flesh and tabernacled with us. We know now the weight of what the tabernacle refers to. And John is using this explicitly to talk about what Jesus is doing. It's so sad that all our translations miss this, and as a consequence, many Christians miss this. What else there's lots of things we could talk about here. John has already set up this prologue as a kind of recapitulation of Genesis 1. The beginning, the opening words sound very much like the opening words of Genesis 1, you might have noticed. And of course, remembering that Genesis 1 is the creation of a cosmic temple. And so John he's opened up creation ideas and temple ideas already here. Now we've got the word becoming flesh and tabernacling with us. We've got other things there that point to Sinai as well. So many, many rich layers. I'm not going to unpack them all because we wouldn't move on. But here is the glory of God. Glory, where does it say glory? Is that the second half? No, it is there somewhere. Thank you. I can't. Yes, thank you very much. The word became flesh and lived among us. We have seen his glory. So here is a place where here's a person, a locus, where glory dwells, who tabernacles with us, who makes God known. John could not make it more clear that here is the living temple. Remember, the temple is the portal between heaven and earth. And here it is vested in one man. Reading on, this mysterious little conversation that Jesus has with Nathanael. Let me read it to you. When Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him, he said, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Interesting word. I'll come back to that. Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." These are hair on the back of the neck tingles here when we read these words. Jesus is referring back to the story of Jacob. Jacob, who we mentioned him earlier, didn't we, wrestling with God. But on his way out, I said he did something bad and he was on his way out, and on his way out he lies in a particular spot, puts a stone under his head, goes to sleep, and he has a vision. And he has a vision of a ladder, or maybe a ziggurat, actually. A ziggurat was how some of the other nations around thought that they could reach heaven. Anyway, it's something reaching up towards heaven. And he sees angels going up and down. This is a portal. This is a portal between heaven and earth that he is seeing. And of course, when he wakes up, he says, this is the house of God. That's temple language. And he names it Bethel, which means the house of God. Jesus takes that, reminds his listeners of that, and says, this is me. I am that portal. And just in case we've missed it, that little phrase, "Here is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit," has to be a reference back to the deceiver Jacob. Yeah? So he's already drawn our attention to Jacob, and then he makes that allusion. So here is Jesus being represented. I'm a portal, he says. Watch me, and you're going to watch heaven being cracked open. I hope the hairs on the back of your neck are standing up. They are on mine. Right. Let's move on. This is another account of the cleansing of the temple. John puts it at the beginning, or near the beginning of his gospel. I'm going to read it to you because I've got a question I want us to think about briefly. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years. We know now about that, don't we? Herod was having a long time on his vanity project. "And how will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So this is, I think, probably the first place in John's Gospel where these Russian dolls are starting to come into focus. Because what we have at the same time is we have the idea that the temple is going to end, and the idea that Jesus as the temple is going to end. We haven't got a Russian doll for Jesus yet. I'm going to do that in a minute. But the idea that these things are not separate. These aren't separate temples. They are, in a sense, the same temple. And I know this is kind of, again, don't try and be too logical about it, because this is a bit too big and rich and kind of almost complex to be too coldly logical with it. But the idea that the temple will end and the idea that Jesus will die as the true temple are kind of saying the same thing. And I'll show you more. Right. Okay, so we were going to come now to Mark 13, which Elizabeth read to us so beautifully. So my question then is, which temple is Jesus foretelling the end of in this chapter? So Mark 13, verses 1 to 2, as he came out of the temple, I have got a photo, I promised a photo, and it's in the final section. But as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another, all will be thrown down." And I think clearly here he is speaking about the physical temple. It seems reasonably straightforward, I think. Probably also in verses 14 to 18, where he says, "But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop should not go down, or don't go back to get anything. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray it may not be in winter." Again, I think he's referring to the fall of the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and he's looking ahead to that. But I don't think that is the only temple that he is talking about in this chapter, because following those verses, he then goes on to say this. "In those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send out his angels and gather his elect." This is not an account of the destruction of the temple in AD 70, I don't think. This is familiar Old Testament language for the end of the world. You might remember the prophet Joel, among others, speaks about the end of the world in terms of the sun darkening. So Jesus has in this one discourse spoken at the same time about the ending of the temple, the physical temple in Jerusalem, and he's speaking about the end of the cosmos, because they're actually the same thing. Hold that thought. So let's now read these words from the crucifixion account in Mark 15. And my question to you is, which temple is ending? "When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Which temple has come to an end? Genuine question. Jesus? Herod's temple. And the end of the world. and it's the end of the world. And Mark brings these temples together. So let's put a Russian doll to represent Jesus as the temple here. Now notice it's bigger. This temple does not get smaller as we go along. Jesus as the temple is way bigger than the tabernacle as the temple. Way bigger than Herod's temple. Way bigger than Sinai. Way bigger, I think, than the cosmos itself as the temple. So here's our new temple. In the same pattern, looks the same, just like Russian dolls are the same all the way down. But here is Jesus as the temple. And at this moment, every temple comes to an end. And we need to get our heads around this. And again, don't be too literal, because we all know that there was a man in a field nearby who was ploughing, and he noticed nothing, okay? You know, Jesus died, the world ends, and he carries on ploughing. We understand that. But there is something of the end of the world at the crucifixion. So Jesus, the true temple, dies. The temple in Jerusalem, the veil is torn open. And we talk a lot about that as opening the Holy of Holies, and that's true, but it's bigger than that. The temple has been destroyed now. It's got to be sewn up again by human hands. I mean, this is not, it has no purpose anymore. That will be made very clear in AD 70, but right now, at this moment, the temple has become redundant, and the rending of the veil demonstrates that. And the world itself has ended. Now, why does this matter? Well, let's think about the resurrection account in John's Gospel. So John shows us, and this is where these themes get mixed up, because now I'm actually dallying with the theme of new creation, or kind of sport my own thunder here, but never mind, that's fine. Because you can't separate the two, because the creation is a temple event. So on the Sunday morning, when Sunday's the first day of the week, and John tells us twice that this was the first day of the week. He's not just putting a note in the diary. He's drawing our attention to something very significant. First day of the week is when the creative act gets going, as it were. Okay, this is the first day of the week. And Mary comes and she sees Jesus, but she mistakes him. Who does she mistake him for? She sees, it's the first day of the week, and she sees a man in the garden and thinks he's the gardener. And I want to say, was she wrong? Now I've got hairs on the back of my neck every time I tell this. Here is the beginning of the new heavens and the new earth. This is something we are waiting for the fulfillment of, but actually it has begun. It began on Resurrection Sunday. That was the beginning of the new heavens and the new earth. And it was only possible because the old heavens and the old earth died on Good Friday. They were destroyed. And when humanity finally reached the, can you say a pinnacle of evil? The depths of its own evil, and destroyed its own creator, it destroyed itself as well, and it destroyed the whole of creation as well. Right, I've no idea how I'm doing for time, so I've only got a couple more slides left, you'll be pleased to know, before we take a break. I want to turn to Hebrews briefly, and now we could spend a lot of time in Hebrews, as I suspect you know. Interesting that the writer of Hebrews speaks about the tabernacle all the time. It doesn't speak about the temple once, as far as I recall, but talks about the tabernacle. Probably because it's a bit too politically hot to actually critique the temple, because it hasn't been destroyed at the point that the writer is writing. So he critiques the tabernacle. It's kind of thin code. So what does he say? There are just two places, I think, that we will notice, we will pay attention to. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens. Have you now got the tripartite geography, the sacred geography here? How a high priest has gone, remember the image, yeah? He's gone up through the cloud into the heavens, and so he has made atonement in the heavenly sanctuary. We have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, so let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The portal has been opened. Our high priest has gone into the highest heavens to make atonement. The work is done. And a couple of chapters later, we have this hope, a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters the inner shrine behind the curtain. Can you hear this temple language? Only the high priest goes through the curtain, goes through the cloud, where Jesus, a forerunner on our behalf, has entered, becoming a high priest forever. I'd love to talk about Melchizedek, but that's for another time, I'm afraid. One more from Hebrews, chapter 8. Now, the main point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary. That's back to Adam language. Do you remember that? To minister, to serve and guard. Yeah, that's that language. A minister in the sanctuary and in the true tent that the Lord and not any mortal has set up. This is the cosmic sanctuary that only God has made. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Hence, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to... I just wonder if I can skim this for you. Well, it talks about about the tabernacle being made according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. We spoke about that last night. But Jesus has now obtained a more excellent ministry. And to that degree, he is the mediator of a better covenant. Jesus is the high priest who has gone through into the heavenly sanctuary and who remains there to make intercession on our behalf. So he is at once the temple and the high priest. One more, and I don't have a slide for this, but I will close with this. Do you know, in fact, I'll read it to you. Do you know Revelation 1? Do you know John's vision of the risen, ascended Jesus? And John was Jesus' friend, okay? But when he saw the risen Jesus, he was flat on the ascended Jesus, he was flat on his face. But just listen to this description of Jesus. When I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. Now, John has given us some clues here. So this is a man who is dressed with a golden sash around his chest and with a long robe. Who wore that? The high priest. This is a man dressed like the high priest. Where's he standing? He's standing among the lampstands. Where are the lampstands in the sanctuary? They are just outside the most holy place. I didn't make a big thing of that because I was talking about the incense burner. But the lamps, so you've got the most holy place. The lampstand's just outside that. So this is someone dressed like a high priest, standing just outside the most holy place, and his face is shining like the sun. Do you remember whose face shone like the sun? Moses. And when did it shine like the sun? When he'd been in the presence of God in the tabernacle, when he'd come out. So this is Jesus, the high priest, who has just stepped out of the most holy place. He's just done his act of atonement, and his face is shining because he has just been in and he's just stepped out. He's among the lampstands dressed like a high priest. This is the image that John gives us of the ascended Jesus. No one else in history is like him, and history itself belongs to him. We'll take a little break.